The following program is made possible by Prescott Tire Pros and Automotive Service. Hello and welcome to the Prescott History Hour. I'm your host, John Krizek, and with us today is Nancy Burgess, well-known, I think, or should be, local historian and author, who's going to lead us on a very interesting tour of Prescott in 1916. It's a wonderful collection of a treasure trove of pictures. So we're going to celebrate what Prescott was like a century ago. So welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, John.
I think this is going to be a fun trip. Now, most people are going to recognize this scene behind us here, this picture which shows the intersection of Montezuma and Gurley. They're going to be looking at that every time we're on camera here. But that's a picture probably taken, it was undoubtedly taken from the old courthouse, right?
Yes.
About what year would you say that picture's?
About 1905.
About 1905. There's a horse and buggy here.
Right. No cars.
No cars. But it was after the
Fire.
The big fire of 1900. So
Yes.
anyway, that's what that picture is. And we want to make sure that we thank the Charlotte Hall Museum for the use of many of the pictures we're going to be looking at.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, with that, Nancy, can you explain this collection of photos? How you came into this collection? This is a treasure trove, and they were glass plate
They
photos.
are glass plates, yes. The glass plates were stored in the basement of the Elks.
In the basement of the Elks.
And there were a number of photographers who had studios in the Elks over the years. And one of my co-workers at the City of Prescott, Mr. Dick Williams, had worked at the Elks and was aware of the glass plates, made some prints and started showing them around town in the 1970s. And he came into my office one day and said, I have all these pictures, and I had heard about the collection, but nobody I talked to knew where it was or who had it or where it had come from or what the pictures were or when they were taken or who took them. And he showed me some prints and he said, do you think we could do a book? And I said, yes, we can do a book. And 10 years later, we had a book.
So how did it happen that these pictures were taken? And do we know who took them?
No. Well, I think I know who took them, but I've never been able to prove it, and until I do, I'm not going to commit myself. But I think they were probably taken with the hope that they would be sold to the various businesses for advertising. I can't think of any other particular reason, and I'm sure there were many more, because there are a lot of local businesses that are not represented in this collection of 125 glass plates.
125.
Yes.
And this photographer apparently went up and down Cortez and and Gurley and Montezuma
And Goodwin
and Goodwin.
Yeah, he was all around downtown. I think the primary business district for Prescott in 1916 were the 4 blocks that surround the courthouse plaza, plus North Montezuma and North Cortez up to Sheldon Street, and East and West Gurley and East and West Goodwin, and South Cortez down to Carlton.
And there are a couple of examples of these photos. They're remarkably sharp and clear.
They are. This was an expert photographer. He was working with a view camera of 5x7 glass plates, 5" by 7". And this is a glass plate. This is a smaller one, but this is what they look like. It's basically the predecessor to nitrate film. So the emulsion was put onto a piece of glass, exposed in the camera, and then when you print it, you just lay the glass on top of the photo paper and expose it. You don't use well, you can use an enlarger, but you normally don't. So when I printed these, this is not one of these glass plates. This is a different subject, but so when I printed these, which took 6 months, I just laid the glass plate on top of the photo paper in a holder that held them together in a tight sandwich.
Well, now by 1916, film was
readily available.
It was readily available.
Yes.
When did film replace glass plate photography?
Well, glass plate photography lasted a very long time. I did glass plates in college, actually, in the 1970s. You could still buy it, but sheet film eventually replaced the glass plates for the view cameras. And by World War II, glass plates were pretty much finished. This is late for glass plates. They really are a 19th century process.
So by 1916, film was the common thing.
Pretty common, but I think a lot of these photographers who'd been working with glass plates and view cameras for most of their career, that's what they were comfortable with, and that's what they were set up for. And they had the glass plates, and they were going to use them.
So when this photographer visited these places, like this machine shop, I mean, he was carrying a cumbersome box.
Yes, a wood box.
A wood box.
On a tripod.
So
but he did not use flash, and that's one of the things that is so amazing about these photos, because basically the flash was gunpowder, and it made a very bright light. So he set all his shots up using ambient light from the windows. Maybe the doors were open certain times of the day. A lot of them were taken in the afternoon, and I know that because you can read the clocks.
You can read the clocks. And I think you also mentioned that you knew the dates of these pictures.
Yeah. Calendars were very popular. A lot of these businesses had 3 or 4. Some of them were for 1916, and some of them weren't. But a lot of them had the page-a-day calendars from the local bank. So I knew exactly what day it was.
And when it comes to identifying where these places were you able to tell where a lot of them actually were?
A lot of research.
A lot of research.
10 years of research.
Yes.
I looked at every interior photograph of Prescott that I could find from any time period up to probably World War II. I took the pictures and we walked around and looked at the ceiling panels to match them up.
Looking at the ceiling panels.
Yeah, I looked at a lot of these buildings don't have side windows because of the way that Prescott is designed and built. They only have front and rear. So if they had side windows, I knew they had to be on a corner. Because of the technology today where you could scan these photos and really enlarge them, and because these are so sharp, you could read signs in the back, the name of a business on a safe, or I could actually read the names of the periodicals in J.S. Akkers newsstand.
Oh, this is great. Let's go back to that original exterior shot on Cortez, which was underneath the credit roll at the beginning. This is a view looking south on Cortez.
Right.
on the west side of the street. Now, all those buildings are recognizable today.
Well, one is not there, but most of them are, yes. The Prescott Hotel is certainly still there today, the store next door, the Hoffman Grill, which is now the office restaurant.
The office.
And then the next building going to the left or to the south is gone. And then the Rabel block and then the Bashford block on the corner of Gurley and Cortez. And you can see how wide the street is.
And it looks like it was dirt,
Yes.
which would have been rather muddy at the time.
Oh, yeah. Prescott didn't have paved streets for a long time.
So that was, but this picture you said was taken before 1916?
Yeah, this is probably again around 1905.
Okay. Well, let's look at some of the other buildings and places that people today can identify with, starting with the banking corner, the corner of Cortez and Gurley.
Well, Cortez and Gurley is the 0 point for east, south, north, and west in Prescott for addressing and for streets. And on the corner were, of course, the plaza on the southwest corner. On the north or southeast corner is the Bank of Arizona, the first chartered national bank in the territory of Arizona. And that building was under construction at the time of the fire in 1900. And behind that, of course, is the Elks. And there's
And I
Bill
can see
the Elk.
there's the elk up on
There's-
top of the Elks.
There's Bill the Elk.
Yeah.
He was installed in 1905 as soon as the building was finished. And he was gone for quite a while, but he came back in 2006, all restored and back on
That's
the
great.
building. And then next to the bank building is the what's now known as the Tiz Gallery, but it's the Knights of Pythias or Hawkins Richards building. One of the few buildings in Prescott that survived the fire of 1900.
And we've got a couple of interior shots in that
Right.
in that building, in that bank building.
Right.
Uh,
Bank of Arizona.
that's what banking. It looked like visiting a bank in those days. You've mentioned an interesting story about banking in those days. Like there were 3 banks.
There were 3 banks on the corner. Well, Yavapai Savings was a little off the corner on the west side of south of North Cortez. But almost everybody, including the ranchers, did all their banking in one of those 3 banks. So the story is, in the afternoon, the bankers would meet out on one of the corners and they'd exchange checks. Because 90% of the time, every check that they got was from one of those 3
from
banks.
one of the 3 banks.
And then the Prescott National Bank was on the northeast corner, and that building's still there today. There was actually kind of a contest going on between the Bank of Arizona and the Prescott National Bank as to which building was going to be taller. And the Prescott National Bank beat them out by about 4 feet.
And on the northwest corner, that's
Bashford
the
block.
Bashford block.
Right,
Now, when I moved to town, there was a bank in that corner.
right.
But before that, that was
It was mostly retail.
Retail.
Early Hiles Drug Store was there, and later on Brisley's Drug was in that space, and
well, now was the Hiles Drug Store right on the corner or somewhere along on the Cortez side?
I don't know. They didn't use addresses much. They would just say Bashford Block across from the plaza, you know, Union Block.
Simple addresses.
Yeah, and the addresses have all changed. So what they started out with bears no resemblance to what we use today.
Yeah. So there's the picture of Hiles Drugs.
Yeah.
It's interesting, again, the detail. You feel
Right.
like you're walking into the store.
Yeah. And Hiles was a compounding drugstore, so it was basically a pharmacy where they made up the drug that you needed while you waited for it out of the ingredients that they had.
And that was a real drug store.
Yes.
Okay, there's another building that's quite recognizable today, and that's the Head Block, or the Head Hotel on
Right.
Cortez. And when we look at a picture of that building, we see a streetcar.
Yes, we do. The Mount Union Railway. The man who started the Mount Union Railway started the electric company in Prescott. And he wanted a way for people to use more electricity. And the streetcars were electric. And so he had dreams of going clear down to Groom Creek and down to the mining district and the Bradshaw Mountains. So what he actually ended up with was it went from just west of Park Avenue along Gurley
Park Avenue
to
on
the
Gurley.
west, right, to Arizona Street.
It didn't go all the way to Fort Whipple.
It did. It turned north on Arizona, and then it went to Fort Whipple. And
Okay.
Fort Whipple had a siding. It did not connect with the Santa Fe, Prescott, and Phoenix.
The railroad.
Right.
It did not connect with the railroad, but it was basically east-west. And the car barn was up on Cortez where the Peregrine bookstore is.
Right. And this streetcar is on North Cortez, and it's either going to or coming from the
Yeah.
car barn.
But the streetcar no longer existed in 1960.
Right. It sort of faded out in about 1912.
Okay, so, but I think I read that between 1905 and 1912, that's the years that the streetcar line ran.
Right. Yeah, the tracks were laid in 1904.
So we've got that Head Hotel building, which contained, well, there's some interesting pictures of the what the lobby looked like in those days.
Yes.
And it's pretty recognizable today if you go in there, although the staircase has been moved. And I notice at the lower left of that corner of the picture of the head block, looks like a white horse in front of one of the stores. Can you
Yes.
explain what that was all about?
Well, the head block was typical of a lot of the major buildings in that it had retail businesses on the first floor. And in this case, hotel rooms. It was a long-term stay hotel, so a lot of people lived there full-time. And sometimes they had offices, but that was kind of the typical pattern. All the lawyers and dentists and doctors were all downtown and upstairs of the buildings around pretty much around the plaza. So the horse is out in front of Caius's saddlery. Obviously, even though transportation is beginning to change, the horse is still very important in Prescott. And Mr. Caius had a very successful saddlery. The horse is made out of wood.
Wood. I was going to ask if it was, they didn't have fiberglass in those days.
No, he's made out of wood. And of course, they'd wheel him out and wheel him in. And he was kind of a landmark on North Cortez.
And there's a picture of the inside of that saddlery.
Yes.
And there's also other businesses in that block.
Right. That whole block, well, the Head block and built by the Head family, had a number of businesses, and including Andrus's cigar store. And some people may remember Emma Andrus. She was a quilter. She had a little museum in what had been her father's cigar store. And she lived her whole life here in Prescott.
What a quilt?
She was a quilter.
But in that store, in a cigar store?
Well, when her parents died, they closed the cigar business, but she kept the lease on the building, apparently, clear into the 1980s.
Interesting. And today we visit that block to go to restaurants and a brewery, and
Right.
it's still a very viable
Antique stores.
yes, antique row. Okay, and there's another well-known block of business that's covered in this series of photographs, and that's on Gurley, right across from the plaza.
Right. the 100 block of West Gurley.
Yeah, and can you describe, we're looking at this sort of from the steps on the north side of the courthouse.
Right. So
And-
you have the mineral fountain in the foreground with a little sign that says "No dogs allowed."
Mineral fountain.
Mineral fountain.
Is that right? That's paved over today, isn't it?
That's gone. Yeah.
It's gone.
Yeah.
And there's
And then there's the Rough Rider Memorial statue, which is not Bucky O'Neill, but it's in honor of Bucky O'Neill and the other Rough Riders. And then we're looking at the
now so the statue is the Rough Rider Memorial.
statue, right? And we're
Because Bucky O'Neill was gone before the sculptor commenced this.
right, and he didn't try to make it look like Bucky O'Neill. He used a model. I mean, it was cast in New York. I don't think he ever probably would have seen.
But because
picture
Bucky
of
O'Neill
Bucky.
is associated with the Rough Riders,
Right.
but it's the Rough Riders.
Rough Rider Memorial statue, yeah,
statue.
installed in 1907 on the plaza.
Okay. Well, now looking at that block of businesses in the background here, can you talk about those businesses?
Well, I'll talk about the buildings first.
Yeah.
Kastner's grocery store is on the far left. That later became a Piggly Wiggly store. That's what I remember it as.
Piggly Wiggly was a
Piggly
grocery
Wiggly,
store.
Yeah, grocery store. Kastner's was a grocery store. And then next to that is the Bashford Burmeister Company store, which was one of the two biggest mercantile stores. All the mercantile stores pretty much advertised that they carried everything. But there were only two that were really large and really carried everything, and this was one of them. And next to that was the Windsor Hotel and Restaurant, and then the Union Block, and then to the right of that, out of the picture, would be the Bashford Block, which we saw earlier in another picture.
Yeah.
So,
And right in there is the building where there's a shoe store in this little building.
right, yeah,
And there's this picture of Bashford Burmeister inside this building.
yeah, right. This
Which-
is the grocery part.
This is the grocery part.
But they carried everything. I mean, the list of things that they carried, and it was a very kind of a fancy store. You could order stationery, and you could buy your Christmas cards, and they had silk blouses and things for women, and silk ties for men. And they were starting to carry ready-to-wear, which was a big change in the clothing business,
And
which
that's
we'll
a
probably
whole-
that's a whole
That's a
nother
whole
story.
nother subject we're going to get into. And you've got one of the ads of the time.
Right. They advertised all the time, and one of my sources of information for figuring out these businesses and where they were the ads. And they were in the newspapers, they were in the Hassayamper yearbook, they had sponsors in the back, they were in the church directories, they were everywhere.
There was another thing that was quite common in those days, and those were tokens.
Right.
People weren't using credit cards, obviously, or writing a lot of checks. They used tokens,
right.
which is kind of an unknown thing these days. Can you describe how those tokens work?
Well, I'm sure you've heard of a shave and a haircut, 2 bids.
Yeah.
Most people don't know what 2 bits means, but it's 25 cents.
Because
And 1 bit is 12.5 cents. So if you wanted to spend a dime at a store, and change was kind of scarce, you might get a token for 12.5 cents, but you had to go back to that store to spend it. So they came in all different sizes and shapes. Sometimes they were for a particular thing, such as a ride on the streetcar, or a loaf of bread, or a drink.
But was a token good only in the store that issued it?
Yes.
Okay.
You couldn't take it someplace else.
So if you had a Bashford Burmeister token, you had to spend it
There.
there.
Right.
And if you had a token worth a bit, and you had 2 tokens worth 2 bits, and that was,
50 cents.
no, 2 bits was a quarter.
Quarter.
So 4 bits was 50 cents.
Right. And you could actually buy tokens. So you could buy 50 cents worth of tokens, and you'd get 12.5 cents instead of 10 cents worth. So you'd make a little. And people would, this happens to be a $5 token. That's kind of unusual, but $5 in trade. And that's a Prescott token. Prescott used tokens from 1881 to 1951.
Clear to the 1950s.
Yeah.
Because I can remember as a kid, not here, but back in Illinois, using streetcar tokens.
Right. It's very common for the streetcars.
But
Well, and then bus tokens later on.
yeah.
They had bus tokens up into the 1970s.
Before we take a break here, I want to be sure we tell people about your book. Now, you've found more pictures than you had when you wrote this book.
No,
Have you not? No?
more pictures, more information.
More information. But this is the book that Nancy authored with Richard Williams, which includes so many of these photos and the stories behind them. And where would one go to find this in this town?
Charlotte Hall Museum gift shop carries it, the Peregrine and the Phippen Museum. And sometimes the Old Sage Bookstore has it. And any of those...
The Old Stage is in the...
St. Michael's.
St. Michael's, right in there.
Right,
yeah.
and any of them can order it.
We'll be right back with more of the Prescott History Hour and this marvelous photographic tour of 1916 Prescott. This program has been made possible by Prescott Tire Pros and Automotive Service at 1635 West Iron Springs Road in Prescott. Here's the happy crew out at Prescott Tire. That's owner Louis Gomez in the middle with his wife Angel, who handles the office. They've been in business in Prescott for over 20 years. Have 14 full-time people on staff, including 2 master certified technicians who are constantly getting recertified. And they take great pride in the quality of their work, and I can attest to that. Louis and the Prescott Tire team have a unique give-back program to the community. In addition to making significant donations to many local charities, 3 or 4 times a year they'll take a vehicle that's been donated and needs repair, they'll fix it up, recondition it, put on a set of new tires, and then donate it to a needy and especially deserving person. For example, last year they donated a recycled minivan to a single mom with 2 kids who was walking 3 miles to work at one of our local department stores. She had no other means of transportation. It's a wonderful program for some very special people who need help. And that's our special team at Prescott Tire out on Iron Springs Road, which has made this Prescott History Hour program possible. Welcome back to the Prescott History Hour. John Krizek here with Nancy Burgess, who is leading us on a fascinating tour, a photographic tour of Prescott in 1916, 100 years ago. Nancy, before the break we were talking about these retail businesses along Gurley Street, right across from the square.
The plaza.
The plaza, thank you. That's the plaza, not the square. Anyway, we were talking about how businesses worked in those days. All these mercantile stores. What did that mean?
Well, mercantile, they all advertised that they carried everything. And they carried from groceries to spring wagons and everything in between. Hay, ladies' clothing, Christmas cards, stationery. So the Bashford Burmeister and J.I. Gardners were the two big mercantiles. So if you wanted to purchase from them, of course you could go into the store and you could use your tokens, or you could make a phone call, send a note, or go into the store and leave a list of things that you needed, and they would be boxed up in a wooden box and they could be delivered to you at your house or your business. Or if you lived out away from town on a ranch or in one of the small communities, it could be put on the train and dropped off for you close to where you would pick it up.
What is what's the store we're looking at here?
That's Kastner's grocery store, which was on the west end of the 100 block of West Gurley, right on the corner, be the northeast corner of Montezuma and Gurley. And it was a small grocery store, mainly dry goods and some groceries. Dry goods are, they carried fabric and shoes and flour and all kinds of dry goods.
And then there's a jewelry store here that we're looking at.
This is Hess's jewelry store, and if anybody's ever seen the clock on the south side of the plaza in front of the close to the post office on Goodwin Street, that was Hess's clock, and it was moved from Gurley Street.
But this store was
this is a fine jewelry store. They carried they were also opticians, so you could go in there and have your glasses made.
And they were right on that same block.
They're in the Union block, right. And right next door to them was Garrett's Barber Shop. And
there's the shoe shine.
And there's the shoe shine stand. And Garrett's was very popular barber shop, and everybody, the cowboys would come in from the ranches on the weekends and get their shave, haircut, and bath, and
get the mud cleaned off.
Get the mud cleaned off and go hit Whiskey Row.
Yes. Also, you described this as a second-hand store?
Yes. I love the second-hand stores. They're fascinating. So this one was in the 300 block of West Gurley. I don't know which side of the street. I think probably the south side. It's Phillips second-hand store, and they actually lived right there. And the variety of merchandise is really interesting. And of course, they have this lovely Victorian wallpaper.
And this is probably where that there's a pet store there today. I think the Barkery.
The Barkery, that's actually the 200 block, so it would be beyond that.
So this
maybe
was
where the
west
bank,
of that?
Yeah, west of that.
Maybe where
The bank is
closer to the creek,
closer to the creek.
where the Bank of America is today.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And
And then we're looking at Akkers Store.
right.
And
Most people.
This was on South Cortez, right?
Right. Most people here probably have heard the name Acker, if they know anything about the Acker Music Night in December.
Yeah.
J.S. Acker was a single man. He was kind of a crabby guy, but he loved kids. And he had a store with stationery and books and magazines and newspapers and postcards. And there's a little girl there with a wagon. She's got a little train in her wagon. This is another photo where you can see an amazing amount of detail. And Acker left Prescott for a while, but he came back in the 1930s and he bought up a lot of property, which he left to the city of Prescott for the benefit of children, and that's how the Acker Music Night evolved.
And that's where the Acker music thing comes
There's
from.
also an Acker Park.
Yeah, that store was probably in that same block where Bill's Pizza is today.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. That's interesting. And also, now you're looking at Gardners here,
J.I. Gardners
and that is today Murphy's Restaurant.
Right. Gardners probably had the first major mercantile store. He built that building for his store. The Gardner family is very well known here. Gail Steiger, whom probably most people have heard of, is his great grandson. I'm sorry. And again, they were right across the street from the depot, so they shipped a lot of goods, a lot of orders.
Went by train.
Yeah. And that's only about a third of the store. But if you go in there today, you can see the same.
Oh yeah, it's a great experience to be in that store.
Yeah.
And then there's Goldwater's. There's a name that most people recognize.
Probably. Goldwater's came to Arizona as freighters way back in the 1870s. They started in Yuma. Prescott was their major store. And of course, they later expanded to the valley. Morris Goldwater was the man of the year, man of the century in Prescott. He was the mayor several times and entrepreneur. But this was the high-end, fancy department store that was catered to the women. And they carried all the very fancy accoutrements that the ladies would need for their home and their personally. And that building, originally they were at the corner of Goodwin and Cortez, where City Hall is today. Then they built a building in 1892 on the corner of Union and Cortez, and that building is no longer there.
There's the ad,
Right.
an ad for Goldwater's.
Right.
They were a high-end store.
Yes, they were.
Okay, let's move to another area, and that's transportation. The railroad was a big thing around here, wasn't it?
The railroad was the thing.
It was the
Yes,
thing.
it was. It was the major employer, for one thing, and it put Prescott on the map. Without the railroad, getting any kind of merchandise here was just a terrible process. It had to either come over the Santa Fe Trail from Santa Fe, or it came from San Francisco or Los Angeles. It came up the Colorado River from
And then
Yuma,
here by wagon.
and then by freight wagon, which was dangerous and very expensive. And anything breakable was highly unlikely it was going to get here in one piece.
But there's the depot,
The second depot.
the second depot. But this building is still there today.
Yes, it was built in 1907 for the Santa Fe, Prescott, and Phoenix, which was a branch line of the Santa Fe off of the Atlantic and Pacific, which runs north of Prescott.
The railroad was big, and there's a bank, M&I Bank, on the corner behind this picture here. There's a wonderful blow-up of a picture of a train being met at the station with a crowd gathered around. There's a lot of pictures about the railroad in this town. It's wonderful. And here is a picture of the ticket office.
Ticket office, taken from inside the office looking out with Mr. Cromwell, the ticket man. And again, this is a photo that has just wonderful detail. You can read all kinds of interesting things in the office. So this was in the depot on the first floor, and you would go in and buy your ticket and for wherever you might be going. On this SFP&P, you would probably be eventually going to Phoenix. Or you'd be going north.
Yeah.
Or you'd be going north to Ash Fork and connecting with the A&P.
So it was a very important part of this community, and of course that required some maintenance.
A lot of maintenance.
A lot of
A lot of
maintenance.
buildings. The coal came in on the railroad, so the coal cars would come in. And so this is one of the shops, and there's a car there in the car barn.
So there was a lot of maintenance that went on. But in 1916, the car was becoming a common newfangled mode of transportation.
Well, I wouldn't call it common in Prescott, but it was certainly here. The first couple of cars to come into Arizona came one into Phoenix and one into Jerome. T.F. Miller had the first car in Yavapai County, and he had to come to Prescott to get it because it came in on the train.
And when was that?
That was about 1912, I think.
About 1912.
And there's a great story about him trying to drive the car because nobody knew how to drive a car. And of course you had to crank it to get it to start. So, but these folks here, Hendy's, well, first we'll talk about the Board of Supervisors.
There's this wonderful picture here we want to take note of. There goes the Board of Supervisors inspecting Senator Highway.
Well, I don't know if they're inspecting the highway, but they are on the Senator Highway, and they are in automobiles. You used to all go out and by horseback.
Yeah.
So that was in 1912, and that was a big step, for them. I'm sure that the county did not own those cars. They have borrowed them from someone in town who's driving. But the advent of the car really changed everything nationally. But the highways were minimal.
They were pretty bad. And here's some interesting shots in the garage.
Right, Hendy's.
Hendy's?
Yeah, he started in Jerome and then came over to Prescott. At the time he was working on cars and storing cars, he also had a livery. So if you needed transportation, you could either go by automobile or horse and buggy at the same time.
So if you rode into town with your horse and buggy, you could park it at the livery, right?
You could, yeah. They'd take care of your horse. And
or if you were lucky enough to have one of these newfangled machines, they'd take care of that for you.
Yeah, and more than likely it needed some kind of repair because they were always breaking down.
Yeah, and there's an ad for a 1915 Maxwell,
right,
which cost grand total of $795. I hate to think of what that would be today.
And that was a pretty high-end car, and those Hendy was the dealer. These little auto shops were dealers for cars. They'd order them.
Where was Hendy's located? Do you know?
Hendy's was on North Cortez.
On North Cortez.
Probably in the north of Willis.
North of Willis, in that block up there.
There's more industrial up that way.
And there's another auto shop.
That's Heisley's.
Heisley's auto shop.
They're actually building cars.
They're building cars?
They're actually building cars. Yeah.
Well, how would you call it? A Buick or a...
You wouldn't.
You wouldn't.
Call it a Heisley's car.
There we call it a Heisley's car.
I'm sure they didn't make very many, but they were pretty enterprising people, and an amazing number of businesses are listed in the city directory in 1916 that have to do with automobiles.
And I've seen pictures, the hardware store.
Sam Hill's.
Sam Hill's.
He was a Ford dealer. He was a Ford dealer.
He was a Ford dealer?
Yeah.
And the block of Montezuma, south of Granite, there were a lot of garages there in the 20s, and so they probably started before then. Well, while the automobile was really becoming a popular thing, horses were still very important.
They were. Not very many people could afford an automobile. And as I said, people didn't know how to drive. And of course, women were not even allowed to drive. So The City of Prescott Fire Department was still using their horses and their horse-drawn fire wagon. Plaza Stables was still doing a big business. There were livery stables, the OK Corral.
Well,
not Corral, but the OK livery stable.
Yeah. Well, now, was this at this time the building that's now the Chamber of Commerce? That was a fire station.
Yeah, but not at this time.
Not at this time.
No, this was on South Cortez, where City Hall is now.
Okay. All right. So, cars were a big thing, but horses still.
And horses still continue today to be important in Yavapai County. Not so much for transportation, but they're still a big part of Prescott and Yavapai County.
Well, it's fascinating to see what was going on in this community we love 100 years ago. And there's so many other great pictures and things that we haven't even got to yet. We're going to have to do this again. We're going to have another Prescott History Hour and cover all those areas that we didn't get to yet, like the saloons on Whiskey Row.
That weren't saloons.
They weren't saloons?
It was Prohibition.
Oh, that's right. That's
and
right.
there weren't a lot of people in the saloons.
Maybe that's when they were hiding in the basement.
Of course.
Of course. Anyway, there's Whiskey Row, there's the men's and women's clothing stores, jewelry stores, the restaurants, the Chinese,
right? The library, Chinese laundries.
There's a whole bunch of stuff having to do with hardware stores. The Bashford block. We haven't visited that area yet. In this picture, that's the Bashford Hotel over here.
No.
It says
This?
Yeah.
That's Brinkmeyer's.
Brinkmeyer's. I'm sorry, I got
your bees mixed up.
I got my bees mixed up. But we've got fascinating pictures of what was going on in that building, which still exists today.
Yes.
The schools. We haven't visited the schools yet.
So we have Washington and Lincoln schools,
Yeah.
elementary schools.
And there are city and county offices.
Assayers,
Yes.
engineers,
mining people, and so forth. So we've scratched the surface in a way with this fascinating 1916 visit to Prescott. So we look forward to another program, another Prescott History Hour, where we can pick up this story right where we're leaving it.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for being here. It's a great story, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
And thank you.
And thank you all for joining us.